This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us this Tuesday, we start with Iowa State University livestock economist Lee Schulz. He provides this week's cattle market update where he explains the similarities between the U.S. and Canada's current livestock inventories and how bull culling is factoring into predictive models for January 1 of next year. Also ahead, Joe Gerken, K-State Fisheries and aquatics specialist, outlines the negative consequences of drought on ponds, streams, and rivers, including increasing the occurrence of blue-green algae blooms. On this week's edition of Milk Lines, Kansas is seeing growth in the production of raw milk, and K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says this will help the state and region become stronger and more productive in the dairy industry. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with Lee Schulz. He is a livestock economist out of Iowa State University, and he's joining us for this week's cattle market update. So, Lee, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. And before I forget, wish everyone a happy Labor Day, and especially to our agricultural laborers. You know, it's a time to enjoy, but also look at all that produced and all the work that goes into that.
Absolutely. I'm glad you said that because, we're coming to you a day later than we typically do, but it's in celebration of Labor Day. So we hope you guys all had a safe and happy Labor Day and long weekend. But, Lee, let's go ahead and get into some of the generals of the market that we've seen in the past week or so. So starting with cash and future markets, what did we see?
Well, as we look at cash market, if you're looking at the Southern Plains, we're in that 140 to 141. When you looked up here north, you looked at Nebraska or the Western Corn Belt, we were in that 143 to 144 range on a live basis. It seems to me, at least when I look at these markets, we're a few dollars lower one week and a few dollars higher the next week. And really, that's been the story. It's been a lot of sideways trade. I know we've seen some support here the last couple of weeks, but really, I think it's this market trying to find an equilibrium. And I think that's something we're going to likely see as we go throughout here, at least the next several weeks. We're looking at futures prices. I can't help and happen to look at where we're at now, in that 144 range on the October contract. But as you get out into April, you have about a $14 spread there. So looking at considerable appreciation in those values. Obviously, April's a big seasonal highs there. But I think we're looking at a period of tightening supplies and likely what we're going to see is higher prices going forward.
Also in the markets, box beef. What did that market hold for us the past week or so?
Well, if you're looking for a bit of bearish news, at least this last week, except for Friday, we did see the market take a step back there when you're looking at about almost a $3 decrease for the week on average. A lot of that came earlier in the week on Tuesday or Wednesday. Again, I think we're just seeing it settle into some of the seasonal fall pricing. We got to remind our readers that we're not responding to the Labor Day holiday at this point. That's in the past, as a lot of those purchases have been made. We may see a bump here in the next week or so on that box beef trade as we're likely seeing some restocking of those sales that were done during Labor Day. But I'll remind us, we're kind of entering that transition period here as we're post-Labor Day and certainly several months before the holidays. So this is typically, a beef demand season that's looking for, something to respond to at least. It's not the holidays that we're expecting in a couple of months, and we're past kind of that summer grilling period, although, weather's still nice and certainly grills are still out.
Absolutely. I think a key thing you're also forgetting there, Lee, is college football started this past weekend, so maybe some response to that as well.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention that. So yes, I think we're all happy that tailgating is back in full swing, and certainly that contributes to protein demand, and beef demand is right at the top of that, right? So I think certainly, yes, I guess I did forget that. That is certainly something that will contribute to this demand, and we hope that it helps carry us through the next couple of months.
Absolutely. Well, we're on the topic of the market in terms of consumers and things like that. Prime premiums have increased lately. Is that true?
Yes, we've seen it, and there is some seasonality to this. Right now we have a rather large choice select spread. It's right in that 21 range, and so seasonally we're starting to see those premiums increase, choice versus select or prime versus choice. But also, what's interesting to me is we've seen weights actually heavier of cattle, even though feed prices are still where they're at, rather large. But you're seeing those cattle grading not to the typical levels if we look at the 5-year average example, or even when we compare it to when the market was a bit backed up post-pandemic, the heart of the pandemic impact. So I think that's something certainly to watch, that packers right now are incentivizing feeding cattle to heavier weights to achieve some of those higher quality grades that we see, and that's what those premiums are reflecting right now. But for a producer, the calculus isn't all that easy, because we're looking at much higher costs for cost of gain on those cattle. And so I think the challenge in there is understanding for a producer is what that optimal weight is, how that balances out the premium versus that cost of gain.
We had a report come out late August. It was the Canadian Cattle Herd Report. So tell us a little bit about this report in and of itself and then what it showed.
This report is a collaboration with USDA's National Agricultural Statistics Service and Statistics Canada. It's a group that's been released for several years now, and really it came down to that producers both in the United States and Canada recognize that we do operate in a North American cattle industry, and there was a value in understanding inventories both in each individual country, but also looking at in aggregate what those inventories were. So as many are familiar with, we have a July 1 cattle inventory report. It reports the national inventories in various categories. And so what this report does is it takes that USDA data for the United States, and it also takes Canadian data from Statistics Canada and smashes them together, so it gives us that U.S. and Canada, and also breaks out those individual countries' inventories. And so to kind of recap there, there's not that much of a surprise. Now, the U.S. is going to dominate most of this inventory, so as the patterns we've seen in the U.S. are going to show the pattern in Canada and the U.S., and that's what shows in the aggregate numbers, where we're down anywhere from about 1% to 2%, depending on what inventory you look at, for those two countries' aggregate industries. Now, when I look into the Canadian industries, the story there, I think, is potential for even further reductions or larger contraction in that Canadian cattle herd. Why I say that? Well, when you look at heifers for beef cow replacement, they're down 7% compared to year-ago levels. It means a lot of those heifers are entering the fed cattle supply. Their beef cow numbers so far were only down 2% year over year. The important thing is Canadian producers have been dealing with a lot of the same challenges that U.S. producers have been dealing with. So drought, very high input costs. Now, as we're seeing, increasing interest rates, how that's impacting producers. So, I think the important takeaway from this report is, as we're seeing tighter inventories, that's not just going to occur in the United States, and with tighter inventories in Canada, that has implications for what we're seeing for imports, both of beef and cattle from Canada, and has implications for our markets medium to long term.
Absolutely. Yeah, that relationship between Canada and the U.S. export and import-wise, I think, is something people often forget about.
Well, and there's a lot of synergies in our production, and I think, that they're important synergies to appreciate, and I think, at the end of the day, we're in this together, and I think we're seeing a lot of those similar impacts impacting producers in Canada as well as the U.S.
Absolutely. You mentioned a lot of the heifers that are currently entering the feeding system right now, and we're seeing strong beef demand in general, but heifers aren't the only ones that are currently, entering the feed market. What else are we seeing?
So you set me up well, Samantha, with a recent article I put together looking at the cull bull market. And what got me interested in here is I couldn't find really much on the cull bull market, of just understanding, the implications of those higher numbers that we're seeing. So it's not just cull cows, the increase there. We're certainly seeing much larger bull slaughter. Now, bull slaughter is a small part of the total market. So we're looking in that 1 to 2% of total slaughter. It's in that 7 to 10 range when you look at just cull cows and bulls. So very small market, but I think it does serve a very important purpose. Remember that our non-fed beef processors, they want to run at capacity, and their ability to do so, I think, hinges on bulls as well. And so if they're able to run near capacity, that certainly helps them on bidding for cull cow and bulls that are available. When I was looking at bull inventories, if you look at the inventories of cows and replacement heifers on July 1, you can do a pretty good job predicting what cow numbers will be on January 1 of the following year. And so how big that beef cow herd is. If you add in bulls into that, you can actually do a little bit better job. And so when I did that to run that model, I get an estimate of the beef cow herd down about 3.1% from year ago levels. And so that would be the fourth consecutive year-over-year decline, and that would put us the smallest since 2014 for the beef cow herd. And why 2014? Well, that was the last bottom in the cattle inventory cycle. And so just to give you a little bit of perspective there.
Absolutely, yeah. The key indication there, comparing it to 2014, that really puts it into perspective how big of a deal this is, how drastic these numbers are. So, wow, great insight in that article for sure, and we'll link it in the show notes of today's program. As always, anything that we have you guys speak about on the show, we always link there, which can be found on agtoday.net. But Lee, anything else before we go?
Well, as I look at this week here, we ended Friday really on an up note, and I think we have the potential to carry that through. As we look at slaughter levels, most are closed on Monday. We're going to have a reduced slaughter level this week because of that, but I think we are seeing fairly strong slaughter pace. As I look at 2022 compared to 2021, we're right at about a year ago levels, maybe up about 1%. So slaughter has been strong, but I think that's certainly helped be supportive of prices and why we continue to see those prices at least trade in the range that we've seen.
Absolutely. Well, Lee, as always, we thank you so much for your time.
All right, thank you.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Lee Schulz. He is a livestock economist out of Iowa State University, joining us for this week's cattle market update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today. We are back now for our weekly wildlife segment. It's going to be a bit longer than usual today because of our holiday that we had on Monday. But today we have with us Joe Gerken. He is our fisheries and aquatics specialist, and we're talking drought today, Joe.
Yeah, so a lot of the state is in a drought status right now, especially we see a lot of it in southwestern Kansas. So down around Finney and Gray counties, they're in really bad drought. We also have a little bit in northwest Kansas, so up near Rollins County, Decatur County, they're really, really dry. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means briefly for crops and then mostly for wildlife.
Absolutely. And I know when it comes to drought, there's a lot of dialogue and language thrown around, and sometimes it can be confusing. People are like, well, I don't know what that means when you say we're, in a zone 3 or whatever that means on the drought monitor, things like that. So maybe explain some of those for us.
Sure. I think one really important thing to remember is that drought isn't consistent everywhere you look, right? It's going to be a state by state and in many ways even a county by county characteristic of where we're at on that scale. So I can't just say, we're 1.5 inches low on rainfall and that be consistent everywhere, because obviously in a desert that's going to mean something different than in an area that gets a lot of rain. So the percentages are kind of just an index to tell us how dry we are. In Kansas right now, 90% of the state is in a drought status, and 60% of the state, just below 60% of the state, is in severe, extreme, or exceptional drought status. And kind of put that into perspective, at this time last year, less than 1% of the state were in those statuses. So It's a very dry year. Some of the areas in northeastern Kansas are experiencing normal rainfall, but a lot of the state's experiencing drought this year.
Absolutely. I think we're kind of almost in a bubble here in Manhattan. We've been really lucky compared to most of the state with the precipitation we have gotten. But like you said, 90% of the state at this point experiencing major drought concerns.
Yep. And so we're seeing things like, crops failing, obviously not enough grass or hay for livestock, so a lot of issues there, dust storms, erosion, runoff. So lots of issues around the state that are causing some agricultural problems.
Absolutely. And some of those agricultural problems, they expand even just from, growing condition concerns. We think about just our crops struggling. But that soil is a key part of that as well. And runoff being one of those major concerns for you guys?
Yep. So we're seeing a lot of runoff, also a lot of wind action. Wind picks up a lot of soil when it dries out. So that runoff, that wind, that erosion is something that we're seeing a lot. The other thing is when soil dries out a lot, it's not as able to absorb water as well. So we see really flashy events when we do get rainfall. It's hard to get back to the amount of moisture that we need in soil for those crops or for cover crops to be successful. So overall, soil degradation is definitely a concern. When we do get rainfall events, that can cause issues in waterways. So we're going to be taking more sedimentation into the water, for example, carrying with that a lot of nutrients. Talked in the past about eutrophication, where we get nutrients in our waterways, and that causes all sorts of problems with algae blooms or plants growing, oxygen depletion, things like that. So definitely a concern.
We've talked about blue-green algae on the program before, but like you mentioned, drought can kind of exacerbate those concerns over those blooms that we already have, and now it seems like they're popping up in a lot of our waterways.
Yeah, and we're definitely seeing that, especially in ponds in a lot of these areas. Southwestern Kansas, that's not a big issue because the ponds are all dry down there, completely dry, rivers. But in some of the areas where we have kind of a more moderate drought, we're seeing blue-green algae blooms still popping up. And a lot of that is, the water. If the water starts to evaporate, those nutrients get more concentrated. The blue-green algae can take advantage of that. The warmer water conditions, stagnant water, it's just a happy place for blue-green algae. So we're seeing a lot of blooms. Again, blue-green algae can be a concern for pets, livestock. Humans can get sick from it too. So if you see something that looks like paint on the top of your water or top of your pond, you definitely want to give us a call so we could check that out.
Does it pose any risk to our fish in some of these aquatic environments?
Fish have adapted to live with blue-green algae. Blue-green algae are present all the time. It's just when there's a bloom that's an issue. So the fish normally aren't affected. You wouldn't want to eat the liver of a fish. If you're handling the outside of a fish, if you're fishing, you want to make sure you wash your hands. But the fish generally don't get hurt. And they're safe to eat as well if you're out fishing. Even if there's a blue-green algae scare, as long as you're not eating the liver and you're washing your hands after you touch them.
Oh, I didn't know that at all. Some other wildlife concerns when it comes to drought, but upland birds are a major concern?
Yeah, in Kansas, especially when we get out to western Kansas, a lot of people are thinking about pheasant and quail populations. And drought can have severe impacts on their populations as well. A lot of that comes down to decrease in nesting habitat. So if the native grasses aren't growing as well, there's not as much habitat for the birds. There's also a lot of the broadleaf grasses or broadleaf vegetation that these birds would eat when they're little or forage on aren't going to be there. So we can see decreases in population and in nesting success. And that's something that we would want to think about. How can we increase their habitat moving forward? How can we make sure that we have some native grasses and forbs that can help those populations? There's not much we can do when there's no water, but we can make a plan where the habitat is there so they can have really good years and other years. And that's something that we want to focus on. Another thing I want to quickly mention is hunting is really popular. People a lot of times think, there's a drought, the bird populations are lower. It's really hard for hunters to have a meaningful impact on the population. Hunting is generally still okay in these populations on the adult birds. And hunters tend to, kind of be fair weather fans too. So if they're not seeing a lot of birds, they're not really going to just keep trudging around, not seeing birds all day. So it's still okay to hunt. We just want to make sure we're making some improvements in their habitats so we can increase their populations moving forward.
Absolutely. And we mentioned that blue-green algae doesn't pose a threat to really our fish communities, but the drought in general does.
Yeah, so dewatering is obviously a big concern for fish. Fish don't have a very good chance of living if there's no water around, so we want to make sure we're doing something about that. And so we are seeing a lot of fish kills. When ponds reduce their surface area, there's a lot less oxygen in that water, and it's a lot easier for the fish to suffocate, literally not have enough oxygen to live. And you can come out overnight and see all of your fish in your pond are dying. And I've gotten probably 10 or 15 calls over the last week or two about this happening. And those are just people that have reached out to us about this.
Wow.
So it's obviously happening around the state. Fish kills are happening. not just in ponds, in rivers as well. And so Dr. Josh Perkin and Dr. Keith Giddo at Kansas State about 5 years ago, they looked at fragmentation in streams in the Great Plains in western Kansas, and they show that after drought, when you get these fragmentation events where the streams aren't connected anymore, that the populations tend to homogenize, so we lose some really important species that maybe aren't as high of densities. So focusing on connectivity, how to get these streams back connected, have some water flowing in them once we get out of the drought conditions, is really important and beneficial.
Along those lines, if listeners are tuning in, they want to make sure they're being proactive about kind of handling the drought in their ponds or, even in public waterways like rivers and streams and things like that. Is there anything that we can actually do?
Well, hope and pray for rain is a big part of it. But, a lot of times the recovery can take months or even years. And so on the quick turnaround, we're looking at 6 months generally to come out of a drought.
Wow.
Sometimes it takes 5 years. Sometimes things don't ever recover. So I think a big plan is to have a plan. A big part of it is to have a plan on how you're going to recover from a drought. So maybe that it means we're going to reduce grazing a little bit in good years so that the plants maybe aren't as heavily foraged and can have a chance to sustain themselves in drought a little better. Maybe it means we're going to reinvest in some irrigation so that we have more water-efficient irrigation systems. So sitting down and having a plan, drought isn't going to go away. It's a natural part of our ecosystem. So I think making sure that incorporating drought into your management plan for your agriculture practice is what's really important. So you can help get through some of those drier years.
And then we always ask for additional resources at the end of these segments because I think people always are left with wanting to hear more from you guys' team. So if listeners are tuning in and they want to know more about some of the subjects we've covered today, where can they find that at?
Well, as always, reach out to your local extension agent. That's a great service, and they're going to have a lot of the information to be able to contact you with a lot of people that could be beneficial. The National Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, would be very beneficial in helping you with the drought. And then the United States Department of Agriculture also has a lot of resources. So I'd kind of start with extension, reach out to NRCS and the USDA as needed. Obviously, if you have wildlife concerns, reach out to me. I'd be happy to help you with that as well.
Absolutely. Well, Joe, as always, we thank you so much for your time, and we hope you enjoyed a little bit longer of a segment to work with today.
Yeah, definitely enjoyed it. Hope I didn't bore all of your listeners too badly.
Never. Once again, that was Joe Gerken. He is our fisheries and aquatics specialist here at K-State. Still ahead of us on this Tuesday's edition of Agriculture Today, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk in this week's Milk Lines says that Kansas is seeing growth in the production of raw milk and that this will help the state and region become stronger and more productive in the dairy industry. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. In this week's Milk Lines, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk looks at changes in milk production over the last 5 years and the opportunities that exist to capitalize on those changes.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning changes in milk production over the last 5 years across the United States. Most of you are very well aware that we've seen a growth in the dairy industry here in the central part of the United States and in Kansas as well, and we've talked about that on this segment previously. However, as we look at the shift in milk production here in the United States, it's actually pretty dramatic in the last 5 years. About 44% of the milk now is produced again in the central part of the United States, and a lesser amount, about 39% in western part of the United States, west of the Rockies. A little bit on the eastern seaboard, only about 17% as you go from Florida up through Maine. So milk production and our importance in the dairy industry here in the central part of the United States is once again growing, and it's actually growing at a fairly rapid rate. it grew about 11% over the last 5 years compared to only about a 5.5% increase in milk production in the western part of the United States. So that is a significant change in where we produce milk, and I think that trend is going to be something we're going to continue to see here in the Midwest as we move forward. So what does that mean? Well, if we see an increase in milk production on the raw milk side, we're going to have an increase in processing plants because that raw milk needs to be turned into different products. Some of it will continue to be turned into fluid, but much of it will actually go into cheese and other products. And if you think about what's going on here in Kansas, it's quite exciting. We have a new cheese plant coming to Dodge City. DFA completed a plant in Garden City just a few years ago that produces dry products at the current time. So we have actually seen this kind of growth here in Kansas, but it's actually happening regionally. This regional growth will actually help us become stronger and more productive in the dairy industry as we have more processing plants added in other states as well. So when you look at cheese production here in the Midwest has actually grown about 20% over the last 5 years. Very significant increase compared to what we had seen in previous years. Now about 48% of the cheese that's produced in the United States actually is produced here in the central part of the United States. This is reflective of what we've seen in cow numbers. Again, as we have more milk produced in the central part of the United States, we're going to have places to process it. One of the things that we actually look at very heavily in the processing industry is increases in cheese production. And again, Kansas is going to benefit by what's happening in Dodge City as an increase in a plant there. Where do we lead in terms of products produced in the United States? Well, surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, is ice cream. We still produce about 59% of the total ice cream produced in the U.S. here in the central part of the United States. Although we've been growing at a slower rate, only about a 2% growth over the last 5 years. But ice cream production actually in the West has dropped by about 32%, and surprisingly on the eastern seaboard it's dropped by about 3% in the last 5 years. So we are still seeing an increase in the production of ice cream here in the central part of the United States. So why do we take time to talk about where things are produced and how we are growing in certain areas here in the central part of the United States? Well, I think it's very important to the industry here in the state of Kansas to understand what are our opportunities going to be to turn raw milk into different products. And it looks like, at least for the near term as we look to the future, we're going to have increased opportunity to turn raw milk into cheese, to some extent to some dry products as well. But it seems like our major growth focus here in the Midwest, particularly the western part of the Midwest, is really toward increased production of cheese and an increased demand in milk that we need for that cheese production. So, short note to the dairy producers, that being the case, we're going to need to produce more fat and more protein, as that is hugely important to the production of cheese. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for the Tuesday edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.